The dust was a shroud, a second skin caked on a third. It coated Sterling Maddox's tongue, filled the cracked leather of his saddle, and settled in the hollows of his soul. His horse, a gaunt Appaloosa named Karen for the ferryman of the dead, plodded forward with the grim, mechanical patience of a creature that had long forgotten the taste of green pasture. They were a matched set, man and beast, skeletal, sun-bleached, and propelled only by the memory of momentum. The town of Redemption rose from the heat shimmer of the plains, not as a promise, but as a final weary exhalation. Its clapboard storefronts sagged like tired shoulders, their paint peeled back to reveal the raw, silvered wood beneath, like bones showing through torn flesh. It was a place that had given up on grandeur and settled for mere existence, a sentiment Sterling understood down to the marrow of his own bones. Hunger was no longer a pang, it was a permanent resident in his gut, a dull, coiling serpent that had devoured hope, pride, and finally even memory. He could barely recall the taste of a decent steak, the weight of a full coin purse, the feeling of his own ranch stretching out under a Montana sky. That life was a ghost story he no longer had the energy to tell himself. All that remained was the gnawing present and the immediate, desperate need for a meal he couldn't buy and a bed he couldn't afford. His gaze, sunk deep in a face carved by wind and worry, scanned the street. Saloon, general store, sheriff's office, all closed to him. His credit was dust, his name a forgotten whisper. Then he saw it, set back from the main thoroughfare, a 2-story house with a porch that listed like a sinking ship and a hand-painted sign that read, Whitmore and McCall Boarding House, Rooms and Meals. The paint was faded, the letters wavering, but it was there. A final, desperate port in a merciless storm. He dismounted, his joints screaming in protest. Each movement was a negotiation with pain. He looped Karen's reins around a weathered hitching post, giving the horse a final, apologetic pat on the neck. "Sorry, old friend," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "This is it, one way or another." He walked toward the house, the dust puffing up around his worn-out boots. The air itself felt judgmental, the windows of the neighboring houses like vacant eyes watching his slow, shameful approach. He expected the door to be bolted, the welcome as cold and hard as the packed earth beneath his feet. He was a drifter, a husk, and the world had no use for husks. He raised a hand that trembled with weakness and knocked, the sound startlingly loud in the oppressive quiet. He half expected a man with a shotgun, a gruff rejection. He was braced for it, had been bracing for it for 1,000 miles. The door swung inward, not with a creak of suspicion, but with a smooth, quiet motion. And then everything changed. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was a physical force, an assault on his senses so profound it almost buckled his knees. Not the stale stench of saloon whiskey or the acrid smell of hot dust, but the holy trinity of sustenance, baking bread, savory stew, and brewing coffee. It was the scent of life, of home, of everything he had lost. The second thing that hit him was her. The woman in the doorway was not what he expected. She was a single mother. He could tell by the faint lines of worry around her kind eyes. But those eyes held no judgment. They were a soft, warm brown, and they looked at him not as a threat or a beggar, but simply as a man standing on her porch. Her name, he would learn, was Mercy Whitmore, and she was aptly named. "Can I help you?" Her voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the harsh world he'd been living in. Sterling's own voice was stuck in his throat, trapped behind a wall of pride and a desert of thirst. He tried to straighten up, to summon the ghost of the man he once was, the rancher who could look another person in the eye. He failed. His gaze dropped to the warped floorboards of the porch. "Ma'am," he began, the word a shard of gravel. I was wondering if you had any work, chopping wood, mending fences, anything, in exchange for a meal." It was the beggar's litany, and it tasted like ash in his mouth. Mercy Whitmore didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her gaze taking in the hollows of his cheeks, the tremor in his hands, the way his threadbare shirt hung from his bony shoulders. He expected the slow closing of the door, the polite but firm refusal. Instead, she stepped back, pulling the door wider. "The stew is ready," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "And there's fresh bread. Come in, you look like you could use a rest." Sterling stood frozen. It was an anomaly, a crack in the cruel logic of the world. Kindness like this wasn't free. It always came with a price he couldn't pay. He was a stray dog, and she was inviting him into the parlor. His instincts, honed by years of hardship, screamed at him to turn and run, to not trust a hand that offered when all others had been fists. But the serpent in his gut uncoiled with a vicious, demanding hiss, and the scent from within the house was a siren's song, pulling him forward. He took one hesitant step, then another, crossing the threshold from the bleached, unforgiving world outside into the fragile, scented warmth of the boarding house. The door closed behind him, shutting out the dust and the despair, and for the first time in a long, long time, Sterling Maddox felt the terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of something that might, if he dared to let it, become hope. The inside of the house was a testament to defiant endurance. The wallpaper was patched in places, its floral pattern faded by 100 suns, but it was clean. The curtains were mended with neat, careful stitches, and the wooden floors, though worn, shone with a soft luster. It was a home built not from wealth, but from scraps and sheer unyielding will. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a living thing that reached out and touched the chill deep in his bones. He stood awkwardly in the entryway, a smudge of grime and failure in this clean, ordered space, his hat clutched in his hands. Mercy led him to a sturdy wooden table in the dining area. A bowl, thick and steaming, was already there. "Sit," she said, her tone gentle but firm. He obeyed, his body moving with a slowness that felt alien to him. He sank into the chair, the simple act feeling like an indulgence. She placed a hunk of dark bread beside the bowl and a mug of black coffee. The steam rose and misted his face, feeling like a benediction. For a moment, he just stared at the food, his mind unable to bridge the gap between his constant, gnawing hunger and this sudden, miraculous reality. He picked up the spoon, his hand shaking so badly that the stew sloshed over the side. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through his exhaustion. "It's all right," Mercy's voice came from beside him. He hadn't seen her sit. "Take your time." He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He focused on the bowl, on lifting the spoon to his lips. The first taste was explosive. Rich beef, soft potatoes, sweet carrots, all swimming in a broth that tasted of salt and herbs, and something ineffably like safety. It was more than food. It was an anchor. It tethered him to the world, to the chair he was sitting in, to this moment. He ate, not with the ravenous gulping of a starving animal, but with a slow, deliberate reverence. Each spoonful was a prayer answered. He tore the bread, sopping up the last of the gravy, until the bowl was clean. He drained the coffee, its bitter heat chasing away the last of the shivers. Only then did he lean back, a profound, bone-deep weariness settling over him, the serpent in his gut finally soothed into a contented slumber. It was then that he noticed the others. A girl, perhaps 16, stood in the doorway to what was likely the kitchen. She had her mother's defiant chin, but her eyes were a cool, assessing steel gray. She held a stack of plates, her posture radiating a fierce, protective stillness. This was Violet McCall. Her gaze was not kind. It was a scalpel, dissecting him, weighing him, finding him wanting. She was the mind to Mercy's heart, the pragmatist, the strategist. Standing slightly behind her, peeking around her skirts, was a small boy, no older than 7 or 8. He had Mercy's wide, curious eyes and a mop of unruly brown hair. This was Tommy. He looked at Sterling not with fear, but with an open, unvarnished curiosity. the way a child looks at a strange new beetle. And upstairs, a shadow moved past a doorway, a fleeting glimpse of another girl, older than the boy, younger than the woman in the doorway. Clara, the defiant teenager. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken questions. Sterling felt like a specimen under glass, the object of a silent, intense debate. Mercy had offered the kindness, but Violet was the one who would count the cost. "He ate it all," Violet stated, her voice flat. It wasn't an observation, it was an accusation. "He was hungry," Mercy replied simply, her calm a shield against Violet's sharp edges. Violet walked into the room, placing the plates on a sideboard with a decisive clatter. She fixed her steel-gray eyes on Sterling. "There's no such thing as a free meal, mister. Mercy's heart is bigger than her purse." "I told her I'd work for it," Sterling said, his voice stronger now, bolstered by the food and the coffee. He pushed himself to sit up straighter, meeting her gaze. "There's a fence out back that looks like it needs mending. I'm handy with an axe." "We need more than a mended fence," Violet said, her tone clipped. She pulled out a chair opposite him and sat down, leaning forward, her hands clasped on the table. It was the posture of a gambler about to lay her cards down. Mercy sat beside her, a silent partner in whatever was about to unfold. Tommy, emboldened, crept into the room and stood near his mother, his eyes still fixed on Sterling. "The town of Redemption isn't fond of two women running a business on their own," Violet began, her voice low and intense. "Especially two widows. They see it as improper, unnatural. Mayor Hutchkins, he's a pious man with a small mind. He thinks this house should be run by a man, or not at all. He and Sheriff Coleman have been making our lives difficult. Inspections. Concerns about the children's welfare." Sterling felt a familiar chill. The petty tyranny of small-town officials. He'd seen it a dozen times. It was a poison that seeped into the soil and soured everything it touched. "They're trying to push us out," Mercy added, her voice trembling slightly, the first crack in her serene facade. "They want to condemn the house, say it's not a fit environment for raising Tommy and Clara. If we lose the house, we lose everything." Sterling looked from Mercy's desperate hope to Violet's fierce pragmatism. He was starting to understand. This wasn't just about a meal. He was being interviewed. He was the subject of a proposal he hadn't yet heard. "What's this got to do with me?" he asked, though a cold knot of premonition was tightening in his stomach. Violet leaned in closer, her gray eyes pinning him to his chair. "We need a man," she said, the words blunt and hard as stone. "Not a husband, not in the true sense. This would be a business arrangement. We need a head of household, a name on a piece of paper, a man on the porch to nod at the sheriff when he rides by, a presence, a shield." The air left Sterling's lungs. He felt as if he'd been thrown from a horse. They wanted to hire him, not for his axe or his hands, but for his gender. They wanted to buy his name, his shadow, to stand between them and the hostile world outside. His first instinct was a gut-deep recoil. It was a lie, a sham. It went against every fiber of his being, against the simple, brutal honesty of the life he'd led, even in failure. Pride, that stubborn, useless weed, reared its head. He was Sterling Maddox, not some hired ghost to haunt a porch. "You're asking me to pretend to be your husband?" he asked, the words feeling foreign and absurd on his tongue. "Our husband," Violet corrected coolly. "Both of ours. A ridiculous proposition, I know, but the more ridiculous, the more they might just believe it. A man taking on two widows and their children out of the goodness of his heart. It's the kind of sentimental foolishness they might swallow." He wanted to laugh. He wanted to stand up and walk out the door, back into the honest dust and the simple reality of starvation. But then he looked at Mercy's face, the plea in her eyes, and he looked at Tommy, who had taken another step closer, his small hand now resting on his mother's knee. The boy wasn't looking at him with curiosity anymore. He was looking at him with a terrifying, naked hope. He was looking at him like a son looks at a father. "We can offer you a room," Mercy said softly, sensing his retreat. 3 hot meals a day, a place to stay. You'd have your own space, your own life. We would ask for nothing more than your presence when it's needed. A home. The word echoed in the desolate, empty chambers of his heart. A roof over his head that didn't leak. A bed that wasn't the cold, hard ground. The promise of food, not as a desperate, one-time miracle, but as a daily ritual. It was everything he craved, everything he had lost. He was walking into a trap, a fragile, carefully laid web of desperation. But the alternative was to walk back out into the wilderness, to let the serpent of hunger coil in his gut again, to let the dust reclaim him. He looked at his hands, resting on the table. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who had built and lost. He thought of his ranch, of the pride he'd felt looking over his own land. That pride was gone, turned to dust along with his cattle and his fields. What was left? An empty stomach, and a future that stretched out like a barren road. Here in this strange, desperate house was a crossroads. Behind him lay the slow death of the road. Ahead lay this. A lie, a performance, a charade. But it was also a chance to eat, to sleep, to breathe. And looking at Tommy's hopeful face, a terrifying thought surfaced, a chance for something more, a purpose. "The mayor and the sheriff," Sterling said, his voice low. "How soon till they come calling again?" Violet's eyes narrowed. Could be a week, could be tomorrow. Sterling took a long, slow breath, the air still thick with the scent of coffee and home. He was weighing his pride against his survival, his instinct to flee against the profound pull of this strange, besieged sanctuary. He looked at Violet's unyielding strength, at Mercy's quiet determination, and at the boy's desperate hope. He was at the end of his rope, and they were offering him a new one to hold on to. "All right," he said, the word costing him the last dregs of his old self. "All right, I'll do it." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the room, a current of released tension. Mercy's shoulders slumped and a watery smile touched her lips. Violet gave a single, sharp nod, the strategist seeing her plan fall into place. But it was Tommy who sealed the deal. The boy broke into a wide, unrestrained grin, a flash of pure, uncomplicated joy that struck Sterling with the force of a physical blow. It was the most beautiful and most terrifying thing he had seen in years. He had just sold his name for room and board, but in the eyes of that child, he had just become a king. The trap was sprung, and as he sat there, in the warmth of the fire, the weight of his new, fabricated life settled upon him, heavier than any saddle he had ever carried. The days that followed were a strange purgatory, a slow, cautious dance of strangers learning the steps to a complicated lie. Sterling was given a room at the back of the house, small and sparse, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto a patch of struggling garden. It was more than he'd had in a year. The silence of the first few days was deafening, punctuated only by the necessary exchange of information. He learned the rhythms of the house, the early morning clatter of Violet in the kitchen, the soft hum of Mercy's singing as she mended clothes, the thud of Tommy's play, the pointed absence of Clara. He worked. He chopped a mountain of firewood and stacked it neatly against the back wall, the clean, repetitive motion of the axe a familiar comfort. He mended the back fence, his hands remembering the feel of wire and wood, the simple satisfaction of making something whole again. He fixed a loose shutter, patched a leak in the roof of the shed, and oiled the hinges on the squeaking front gate. He ate 3 meals a day. The sharing of food, as the prompt had foretold, became the central ritual of their coexistence. Breakfast was a quiet affair, the 3 adults sipping coffee while the children ate oatmeal. Lunch was often bread and cheese, eaten on the porch, but dinner was the anchor of the day. They would gather around the big wooden table, the steam from a pot of stew or a roasted chicken rising between them, and for an hour, the silence would feel less like a void and more like a shared respite. Sterling found himself watching them. He watched Mercy move through the house with a quiet grace, her hands always busy, her presence a constant, calming influence. She was the one who ensured his plate was full, who left a fresh cup of coffee by his elbow when he was working. Her kindness was not a performance, it was the very fabric of her being, a form of defiance against the harshness that pressed in on them. He watched Violet, sharp-edged and vigilant, her eyes missing nothing. She managed the books, haggled with the suppliers from the general store, and planned their strategy like a general preparing for a siege. She spoke to Sterling in clipped, practical sentences, her trust not given but held in reserve, waiting to be earned. And he watched the children. Clara remained a ghost, a resentful shadow flitting at the edges of their new reality. She would appear at meals, eat in stony silence, her eyes filled with a defiant impatience, and then vanish back to her room. She saw the arrangement for what it was, a desperate gambit, and her teenage pride was wounded by it. But Tommy was different. The boy was a satellite, slowly, cautiously, entering Sterling's orbit. He would watch Sterling work, his small face a mask of concentration. He'd ask tentative questions. "Is that axe heavy? Did you ever see a real wolf?" Sterling, who hadn't spoken more than a few words at a time to anyone in years, found himself answering. His responses were gruff at first, monosyllabic. But the boy's relentless, innocent curiosity was like water dripping on a stone. One afternoon, as Sterling was sharpening the axe head, Tommy sat on a nearby log. "My PA, he was a carpenter," Tommy said, his voice small. "Mama says he could build anything." Sterling didn't stop his work. "That's a fine trade," he grunted. "He went to heaven," Tommy added, stating it as a simple, unadorned fact. "Violet's husband, Mr. McCall, he went there too. A fever took 'em both. That's what Mama says." Sterling paused, the rhythmic scrape of the whetstone falling silent. He looked at the boy. There was no self-pity in his voice, just a child's attempt to make sense of the vast, empty space in his life. The need for a father figure, the prompt had called it. It wasn't a craving. It was a wound. An empty chair at the table that no amount of stew could fill. "I'm sorry to hear that, son," Sterling said, the words feeling inadequate. "Are you going to go to heaven soon?" Tommy asked, his brown eyes wide and serious. The question hit Sterling like a fist to the gut. The boy wasn't being morbid. He was being practical. He was asking if this too was temporary. "Not planning on it," Sterling managed to say, his voice rough. "Got fences to mend." A small smile touched Tommy's lips. It was a victory, a tiny seed of trust planted in the barren soil of their arrangement. From that day on, the boy was his shadow, handing him nails, carrying small pieces of wood, his constant, hopeful presence a quiet pressure on the walls Sterling had built around his heart. The tension in the house, however, was a living thing. It rose with the dust motes in the morning sun and settled with the chill in the evening air. It was the knowledge that their fragile sanctuary was built on a foundation of lies, a foundation that could crumble at any moment. The test came on a Tuesday, a week and a half after Sterling's arrival. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and a breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood in the front yard. Sterling was on the porch, reseating a loose floorboard, when he saw them. Two figures on horseback, riding slowly down the street, their destination unmistakable. One was a portly man in a suit too tight for his frame, his face flushed with self-importance. Mayor Hutchkins. The other was a lean, wiry man, with a tin star pinned to his vest and a pair of cold, flat eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Sheriff Coleman. Sterling's blood ran cold. He felt a primal urge to bolt, to melt back into the landscape and disappear. This was the moment. The performance was about to begin. He slowly got to his feet, the hammer heavy in his hand. Inside he heard the sudden silence, the cessation of all movement. The women knew. He stood his ground as they reined in at the gate. Sheriff Coleman swung down from his horse with a fluid, predatory grace. The mayor dismounted with a grunt of effort. They didn't bother with the gate, just pushed past it and walked up the path, their boots loud on the packed earth. "Afternoon," the sheriff said, his voice a low drawl that held no warmth. His eyes flicked from Sterling to the house and back again. Didn't know the ladies had taken on a hired man. Sterling's heart was a drum against his ribs. He could feel the eyes of Mercy and Violet on him from behind the parlor window. He could feel Tommy's hope, Clara's cynicism. He was no hired man. He was supposed to be the head of this house. He had to say the words. He wiped his sweaty palm on his trousers and forced himself to meet the sheriff's gaze. "I'm not the hired man," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I'm Sterling Maddox. This is my home." The words hung in the air, audacious and fragile. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. Mayor Hutchkins hitched up his pants and stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Maddox?" the mayor boomed. "Don't know that name. And what do you mean you're home? This boarding house is registered to Mercy Whitmore and Violet McCall." This was the crux of it. The lie had to be sold, and sold with conviction. Sterling remembered Violet's words, a presence, a shield. He straightened his shoulders, calling on a ghost of the authority he once possessed as a landowner. "That's right," Sterling said, his tone even. "I've taken the ladies as my wives. We're making a family here. Thought it was time this house had a proper man to look after it." He used their own prejudiced language against them, a bitter taste in his mouth. Mayor Hutchkins blinked, his face a comical mask of surprise and suspicion. "Wives? Plural? That's highly irregular." "It's a hard world, Mayor," Sterling said, letting a hint of weariness into his voice. "A man does what he must to protect his own. These are good women. Their children needed a father. I was in a position to provide." The lie was taking shape, becoming more solid with each word. He wasn't just reciting a script, he was building a narrative, the kind of sentimental foolishness Violet had predicted they might swallow. Just then, the front door opened. Mercy and Violet stepped out onto the porch, standing on either side of Sterling. They didn't touch him, but their proximity created an undeniable tableau. The family unit. Mercy's face was placid, her hands clasped in front of her. Violet's was a mask of cool indifference, her chin high. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" Violet asked, her voice sharp as glass. Sheriff Coleman's gaze swept over the three of them. He was the more dangerous of the two, his silence more threatening than the mayor's blustering. "Just making our rounds, Violet. Town has an interest in the welfare of its citizens, especially the children." He let the last word hang in the air, a clear and potent threat. "The children are fine," Sterling said, his voice dropping, taking on a hard, protective edge he hadn't felt in years. "They have a mother, 2 of them, and now they have a father, my children, and this is my house." He took a small step forward, a subtle but unmistakable claiming of territory. "So if you've got official business, state it, otherwise you're trespassing." The challenge was laid. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind rustled the leaves, the only sound in a world holding its breath. Sterling could feel the sheriff sizing him up, weighing the cost of pushing further. Coleman was the law, but Sterling was standing on his own porch, or what he now claimed as his own porch, and in the West, that still meant something. Finally, the sheriff gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "No official business," he said, his eyes still locked on Sterling's. "Today." He turned and walked back toward the gate. The mayor, flustered and robbed of his momentum, sputtered for a moment before turning to follow. "This is not the end of this, Maddox," he called over his shoulder. "We'll be watching." Sterling watched them mount their horses and ride away, their departure leaving a vacuum of tension in its wake. He didn't relax until they had turned the corner at the end of the street. Only then did he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His legs felt weak. The hammer in his hand was slick with sweat. He turned. Mercy was looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of relief and something else, something that looked dangerously like gratitude. Violet's expression was unreadable. but the rigid line of her shoulders had softened. "You did well," Violet said, the closest thing to a compliment he had yet received from her. He just nodded, too drained to speak. He had passed the first test. He had stood his ground, had spoken the lie and made it sound like the truth. But it was more than that. In that moment of confrontation, standing between these women and the hostile world, he had felt a flicker of his old self. Not the broken drifter, but the man who protected what was his. The declaration wasn't just a lie for their benefit. He knew, with a sinking and exhilarating feeling, that it had been the first step toward a new, terrifying, and irreversible truth. The charade had begun, and he was now its reluctant but committed leading man. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the house like a fine layer of dust, changing the atmosphere in subtle but profound ways. The fragile arrangement, once a thing of whispers and desperate hopes, had been spoken aloud, given a name and a shape in the hard light of day. It was no longer a secret shared between the three adults. It was a public declaration, a line drawn in the dirt. Sterling felt the shift in the way they looked at him. The caution in Mercy's eyes was slowly being replaced by a tentative trust. She started talking to him more, not just about chores, but about the weather, about Tommy's latest scraped knee, about the price of flour at the general store. They were the small, mundane conversations that weave strangers into the fabric of a shared life. Even Violet's sharp edges seemed to have been blunted, if only slightly. She still watched him with her assessing gray eyes, but now there was a flicker of something new in them, reluctant respect. She began to include him in her strategic discussions, laying out the household finances on the kitchen table one evening, showing him the thin margin they lived on. "Hutchkins won't let this go," she said, tapping a finger on a column of figures. "He'll use any excuse. The house, the children, we have to be unimpeachable." He wasn't just the shield anymore. He was being brought into the war council. Clara, the resentful ghost, even began to thaw. She started spending more time downstairs, her book held in front of her like a shield. But she was present. She listened. One evening, as Sterling was oiling the leather of his saddle on the porch, she came out and stood watching him for a long time. "That's a fine horse," she said finally, her voice surprisingly soft. "He's seen better days," Sterling replied, not looking up. "Same as his owner." "My father liked horses," she said, a rare offering from her private world of grief and anger. "He said you could judge a man by how he treated his animal." She glanced at the well-cared-for Karen. "He would have said you were a decent man." Then, as if embarrassed by the admission, she turned and went back inside, leaving Sterling alone with the scent of leather oil and a startling sense of connection. But the most significant change was in Tommy. The boy no longer orbited him. He was docked. The space between them had vanished. Tommy was a constant presence at his side, his small hand often finding its way into Sterling's much larger one, as they walked to the woodpile or checked the fence line. The boy's trust was a physical weight, a responsibility that settled deeper into Sterling's bones with each passing day. He found himself teaching Tommy how to tie a proper knot, how to tell a hawk from a vulture by the shape of its wings. He was stepping into a role he had never wanted or imagined, and finding, to his astonishment, that it fit. The peace, however, was temporary. It was the quiet at the center of a storm. They all knew Hutchkins and Coleman would be back. They waited, and the waiting was its own form of torture. It came 2 weeks after the first visit, on a gray, overcast morning that promised rain. The knock on the door was harder this time, more insistent. It wasn't a social call. It was an invasion. Sterling opened the door to find both the mayor and the sheriff on the porch, their faces grim. This time, they didn't wait for an invitation. The sheriff pushed past him, his presence filling the small entryway. "Official inspection, Maddox," Coleman said, his voice flat and cold. "We have received complaints, concerns about the living conditions, the moral environment." "Complaints from who?" Violet demanded, appearing at Sterling's side, her face a thundercloud. Anonymous concerned citizens, the mayor said with a smug, unctuous smile. He held up a piece of paper. We have a writ. We are here to inspect the premises and to speak with the children. Alone. The last word was a declaration of war. Sterling felt a surge of cold fury. To question them was one thing. To attempt to turn the children against their mothers, to interrogate them, to poison their minds. That was a violation he could not abide. No, Sterling said, his voice a low growl. He physically blocked the doorway to the main room. You can inspect the house, you can look in the pantry and check for dust on the mantelpiece, but you will not interrogate my children. The sheriff took a step closer, his hand drifting casually toward the Colt peacemaker on his hip. That's obstructing the law, Maddox. Are you sure you want to go down that road? A drifter like you with no history here? It wouldn't take much for you to end up in a cell, or worse. The threat was naked, brutal. Sterling felt Mercy's hand on his arm, a trembling touch that urged caution. He could see the fear in her eyes. This was the precipice. One wrong move and their entire fragile world would shatter. He had to let them in. He had to trust that the home they had built, however temporary, was strong enough to withstand the assault. He gave a stiff, reluctant nod and stepped aside. The inspection was a slow, deliberate violation. Hutchkins ran a finger along a windowsill, searching for dirt and finding none. Coleman peered into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the neatly stacked provisions. They moved through the ground floor like a plague, their very presence seeming to taint the air. All the while, the family stood together in the center of the room, a silent, besieged unit. Tommy had pressed himself against Sterling's leg, his small body trembling. Clara stood behind her mother, her usual defiance replaced by a pale, watchful fear. Everything seems to be in order downstairs, the mayor said, clearly disappointed. Now, the children. He turned his oily smile on Tommy. Son, why don't you and I have a little chat? Tell me about your new father. This was it, the breaking point. This was where the line had to be drawn not in sand, but in granite. Before Mercy or Violet could protest, Sterling stepped forward, placing himself directly between the mayor and the boy. The movement was not aggressive, but it was absolute. It was the movement of a mountain. I told you, Sterling said, his voice dangerously quiet, all the grit and gravel of his past life stripped away to reveal something hard and pure beneath. You will not speak to him alone. This is not a negotiation, Hutchkins blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. I am the mayor of this town, and I am conducting an official inquiry into the welfare of this child. And then, something inside Sterling Maddox, something that had been broken and dormant for a decade, snapped into place. It was not the pride of a landowner, not the stubbornness of a survivor. It was the incandescent fury of a protector. He looked past the mayor, past the sheriff, and seemed to be addressing the entire judgmental, hypocritical world they represented. His voice, when he spoke, did not thunder. It was low, intense, and it carried the weight of a lifetime of loss and one last precious thing to defend. You want to know about welfare, Mayor? You want to talk about what's proper? He took a step closer, and for the first time, Hutchkins took an involuntary step back. Let me tell you what's proper. Proper is a roof that doesn't leak over a child's head. Proper is a fire in the hearth when the world outside is cold. Proper is a full belly, a clean shirt, and a mended blanket. His gaze flickered to Mercy and Violet, who stood frozen, watching him with a mixture of terror and awe. You see these two women? You call them improper. I call them warriors. They have fought tooth and nail in a world that wants them to fail, in a town that whispers behind their backs. They have built this home from nothing but grit and grace. They have kept these children safe and loved when they had no one else to turn to. That's not just proper, Mayor. That is a miracle. And you dare to walk into their home, this sanctuary they have bled for, and question their honor? He advanced another step. The mayor was now pressed against the dining table. The sheriff's hand was on his gun, but he was hesitating, caught off guard by the sheer moral force of Sterling's words. You want to know about the moral environment? Sterling's voice was raw now, laced with a pain that was both ancient and immediate. Look outside. Look at your town of redemption that offers none. Look at a world that throws a man away when he loses his land, that leaves women and children to starve because their husbands had the misfortune of dying. That is your moral environment. In here, he swept a hand around the room, at the patched wallpaper and the mended curtains, in here is decency. In here is kindness. In here is a family. He let the word hang in the air, a final, definitive statement. He wasn't acting anymore. He wasn't playing a role. In that moment, he believed every word with the fire of a religious convert. He had found his church. He turned his back on the mayor, a gesture of ultimate contempt, and knelt down so he was eye level with Tommy. He put his large, calloused hands on the boy's small shoulders. No one, he said, his voice soft now, for the boy alone, is ever going to hurt you, not while I'm here. It was then that it happened, the small, sacred gesture that sealed everything. Tommy, his eyes wide and shining, reached out a small hand. He didn't grab Sterling's shirt or arm. He laid his hand gently on the side of Sterling's weathered face, a touch of absolute trust, of unconditional acceptance. It was a benediction, a vow. In that single, silent moment, a bond was forged that was stronger than any law, more real than any blood tie. Sterling Maddox, the broken cowboy, the drifter, the hired ghost, ceased to exist. In his place stood a father. He stood up slowly, Tommy's hand still clinging to his trousers. He faced the two officials, his expression transformed. The despair was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty. He had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The sheriff looked from Sterling's face to the boy's hand, to the fierce, protective stares of the two women. He saw not a sham, but a fortress. He had lost. He knew it. Without a word, he gave a curt nod to the mayor, a signal for a tactical retreat. Hutchkins, deflated and speechless for the first time in his life, scrambled to follow him. They walked out the door, not with the swagger of authority, but with the haste of the defeated. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. The invasion was over. The home had held. The adrenaline drained out of Sterling as quickly as it had come, leaving him feeling hollowed out and strangely light. The silence that filled the room was different now. It wasn't the silence of tension or caution. It was the quiet aftermath of a battle won, the stillness of shared victory. He could hear the gentle patter of the promised rain beginning to fall outside, washing the dust from the air, a soft, cleansing sound. He looked at the others. Violet stood by the sideboard, one hand pressed to her mouth, her steel-gray eyes wide and glistening with an emotion he had never seen in them before. Mercy hadn't moved from his side, but she was no longer trembling. Her hand rested on his back, a steady, warm pressure that was both grounding and revelatory. Tommy was still clinging to his leg, his small anchor in this new world. And Clara, standing in the doorway to the hall, was looking at him not with teenage cynicism, but with a dawning, reluctant admiration. No one spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. The lie they had constructed had been tested by fire, and in the crucible of that confrontation, it had been forged into something real. He had defended them, yes, but in doing so, he had found the part of himself he thought was long dead and buried under 1,000 miles of dust and failure. Slowly, as if coming out of a trance, Violet walked to the hearth and added a log to the fire. The simple, domestic act broke the spell. Mercy let out a long, shuddering breath and squeezed his arm before moving toward the kitchen. "I'll make coffee," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The afternoon bled into evening. The rain continued to fall, a steady, soothing rhythm against the roof. The world outside felt distant, muted. Inside the boarding house, their fragile sanctuary, a profound sense of peace began to settle. They ate dinner not as co-conspirators, but as a family that had weathered a storm together, The conversation was sparse, but the looks that passed between them were freighted with new meaning. They were pillars of a home they had successfully and fiercely defended. Later, after the children were in bed, the three of them sat on the front porch. The rain had softened to a fine mist, and the air was cool and clean, smelling of wet earth and distant wood smoke. The town of Redemption was dark and quiet, its judgmental eyes finally closed in sleep. Mercy brought out 3 steaming mugs of coffee. Sterling took his, the warmth seeping into his hands, chasing away the last of the chill. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, the world turning to shades of deep blue and charcoal gray. The porch swing creaked gently as Mercy rocked back and forth. Violet sat in a straight-back chair, her posture relaxed for the first time since he'd met her. Sterling leaned against a porch post, the rough wood solid against his back. He thought of the man who had ridden into town, a ghost haunted by failure, expecting nothing but rejection. He thought of the gnawing hunger, the crushing despair. It felt like another lifetime, like a story about someone else. He had lost a ranch, a herd, a name for himself in the world. But here, on this sagging porch, with a cup of coffee in his hand and 2 strong, remarkable women at his side, he felt a sense of belonging more profound than any deed of ownership had ever given him. He had come here seeking a meal and a bed. He had stayed for a lie, but the lie had become a truth, and the arrangement had become a purpose. His redemption hadn't come from reclaiming what he'd lost, but by dedicating himself to protecting what these women were about to lose. Mercy's soft voice broke the quiet. "Thank you, Sterling." It wasn't just for the confrontation with the mayor. It was for everything. Violet, ever the pragmatist, added, "It's not over. They'll be back." "I know," Sterling said. And he did, but for the first time, the thought didn't fill him with dread. Let them come. He took a sip of his coffee, the taste rich and bitter and real. He looked out at the darkened street, no longer a drifter passing through, but a man standing watch over his home. The quiet peace that settled over him was not the giddy thrill of victory, but something deeper, more lasting. It was the bone-deep satisfaction of finding his place in the world, not in the wide-open spaces of a cattle ranch, but on the small, cluttered porch of a boarding house in a town called Redemption. It was the quiet, hard-earned tranquility of a soul that had finally, against all odds, come home. The story wasn't over, but this was its true beginning, born not of blood or law, but built one splinter, one scar, and one quiet moment of shared coffee at a time. It was the dawn of a real family, glowing softly in the rainy twilight.